Full disclosure, you and I worked together once a long, long time ago.
Right.
In the same place.
We won't say how many years.
No, we won't. I don't want to think about that. You still look younger than I do. Okay, I want to start actually with the Judge Kavanaugh nomination, which of course is the talk, certainly of Washington and of much of the nation right now. You've written a piece on this subject, and I'll just quote it for you so we can talk about it. This is not the right place, not the right time, not the right way for a national referendum on the MeToo movement. And even if the headlines try to call it that, we should at least be honest enough to admit that it isn't what this is at all. An interesting point, but let me ask you something maybe related. If we had not had Me Too, would we be in the same place with respect to this nomination? Doesn't Ronan Farrow actually deserve some of the credit or blame for the extreme attention being given to this?
Well, I think he gets credit for the fact that we now are not tolerating conduct that was once considered acceptable. And I think that's an enormous step forward. What I meant in that quote was that, I remember it was just a few years ago, wasn't it, that Al Franken was under attack, the senator, for hugging and touching in some comedic routine. And all my friends on the Democratic side said, oh my goodness, what is the big deal? Or many of them did, this is just a hug, this is comedy, this is nothing. And then we all switched sides again. And it's hard not to notice that everybody on the Democratic side is sort of saying, oh my God, it's an attempted rape. And people on the Republican side don't quite know what to say. And my question, I guess, for everybody is, is this really the key issue for Kavanaugh? I mean, I got a lot of issues with Kavanaugh in terms of his position on choice, on guns, on assault weapons. But I'm not sure how we're going to get to the bottom of what happened at a party 30 years ago. And I'm not sure we should be trying on national television after the hearings are already over.
So that's interesting. I mean, if you were back in your old job at the Judiciary Committee, and it would be great if Teddy Kennedy were back with us, actually, but if you were back in the old job, would you be urging that they actually not call her as a witness and not keep the hearings open? Would you just say, let's have a vote?
No, what I would have been doing, and what I don't understand about this, David, is when you get a report like this in, whether it's on a nominee, I went through it with, presidential vetting processes of vice presidential possibilities. When you get a report like this in, you generally refer it to the FBI or you refer it to your investigators and you say, look, is there anything to this? If the woman doesn't want to come forward, it's obviously very difficult to investigate. But you want to look and see, is this part of a pattern? Are there any other instances like this? I mean, this should have been investigated back in July, and a decision should have been made by the senators, potentially in a closed session, whether they wanted to talk to her about it, whether they wanted to talk to him about it, whether there was more to this, whether they could figure out what actually did happen 30 years ago and whether it was relevant. What I'm troubled by right now is that we're facing sort of like a circus, and it's going to be a circus with no winners. This poor woman is being attacked. Her children are being attacked. Judge Kavanaugh is being attacked. I'm not sure I can remember what happened at parties 35 years ago. I'm willing to admit that both of them are probably telling the truth as best as they can remember it. And I'm not sure that's the real reason anybody is going forward with these hearings. I have a feeling that it's a lot more circus and show than it is a real deliberative process.
Well, let's try to tease out the circus for a moment and get to the substance. And let me ask you the question this way. Cass Sunstein, somebody you know, and I know respect as I do, wrote for Bloomberg recently that the question is not whether it happened or not. The question is there a significant chance that it happened? Because if there were, for example, in his hypothetical, a 30% chance that it happened as she describes it, would he ever have been nominated if they'd known that at the time? Is that a fair way to look at it? What's the question for the senators? Are they deciding, is it a preponderance of the evidence? Who's got the burden? How do they decide that?
I think the real question for me, at least, is even if she's telling the truth as she remembers it, is this a reason that this man should not be on the Supreme Court? If your answer is yes, fine, then you need to know the truth. If your answer is, wait a minute, if this is an isolated incident of something that happened in high school when both of them were a little bit drunk and never went further than his attempting to put his hand under her bathing suit, if that's all there is to it, is this what should hold somebody back from being on the Supreme Court? I mean, look, Barack Obama, for whom I have the greatest respect, was honest enough to admit that he had a history with illegal drugs. I worked for Ted Kennedy. He had a terrible accident at Chappaquiddick. I'm just not sure we want to send out the sex police going through everybody's high school records to find out who's qualified to serve on the bench. I'm really not.
So let's assume for the moment, as Mitch McConnell said today, they take it to a vote, it gets approved, he becomes Justice Kavanaugh, he goes to the Supreme Court. What difference does it make? Does it affect the court? Does it affect the way that the court is perceived?
I'm not sure this one does. I mean, I was much more troubled, David, by the whole Anita Hill, Clarence Thomas issue, not because the accusations against Clarence Thomas would have bothered me that much. Look, I've put up with much worse than jokes and bad language and the like, but because he was chairman of the EEOC at the time, and she was a young lawyer working for him, and it had the smackings of abuse of power. This is about something that happened when they were teenagers, and I just hope we don't use it to tear the country apart when what we're really fighting about is what happened in the last election and perhaps what will happen in the next one.
So finally, Susan, how much more difficult is this issue because of who the President of the United States is? We have the President of the United States who has been on tape saying things that he would do with women that would not be acceptable in most places. And then he comes out and says, I really believed in this man. I think he's a good man. Does that actually impose an extra amount of freight, whether justifiable or not, in people's minds?
Yep. Well, I think, you know, the president's tweet this morning was just enough to make me, who's trying to remain calm and have perspective here, furious. I mean, when he said, well, of course, if it happened, she would have told her parents. I thought just what we don't need in the middle of this is a president who has no understanding whatsoever about what it must be like to be a teenage girl in a bad situation, you know, giving his opinion on this. I think the more the president weighs in, the more it will hurt Judge Kavanaugh.